Luke chapter 15 for the rest of us. Luke 15. If you're using one of the Pew Bibles, you'll find it on page number 631. It's helpful. You don't got to go searching. While there's many stories in the Bible that are like this story, the story of the prodigal son is perhaps the most preeminent, the most famous story. And really, if we were to take Luke 15 itself, it is really a miniature version of the Bible as a whole. In other words, if we boiled down the whole of what the Bible is attempting to communicate to man, we would have Luke 15. Now, I mentioned last week that we're going to cover this story in 3 sections. In other words, we're going to split it and discuss it in 3 different versions. But with that being said, and as a reminder to us, this story is given by Jesus as a response to the Pharisees and scribes. And the main thrust, the crux, if you will, of what Jesus is trying to get at is the last part of chapter 15 about the elder brother. That's what that's the thrust of his message in response to the Pharisees and scribes. But we do understand that this and the stories in verses 4 through 10, they are for all people in general still. Everyone can find themselves and is described within Luke 15, whether they are the elder brother or the younger brother. And so, let's read the first 3 verses of Luke 15 to get us started this morning. Verse 1 says, "Then drew near unto him all the publican sinners for to hear him, and the Pharisees and scribes murmured, saying, This man receiveth sinners, and eateth with them. He spake this parable unto them, saying," and then skip down to verse 11, "And he said, A certain man had 2 sons." Now, I don't know if this is a true story. Generally, if it's a true story, there would be names involved. It could be because of the way that Jesus describes this in saying, a certain man had 2 sons. And thus, that is often how he depicts a real story of things that happen. Now, for us to understand this story about the certain man with 2 sons, we do need to realize that this has a large amount of first century Jewish cultural context behind it. And I'm not saying that if we were to look at it as it is, that we would not understand the truth of the story and what he's trying to display. But when we understand how that culture functioned and how things happened in that culture, we would then understand a little bit more the significance and the sheer power behind this story. And so, just so you're aware, we're going to step back at times to understand what's going on culturally speaking as Jesus is telling this story, and how this would have caused, and I would have loved to have seen the looks on the faces and the understanding of the scribes and Pharisees as Jesus tells this story to them, and as they realize the phenomenal truth that Jesus was talking about them. Well, the first step back we're going to take is in verses 11 through 13, and there we will find the prodigal son living the high life. The prodigal son living the high life. Verse 11 says, "And he said, A certain man had 2 sons. The other younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the portion of goods that falleth to me. He divided unto them his living. Not many days after, the younger son gathered all together, and took his journey into a far country, and there wasted his substance with riotous living." Now, our introduction to this story begins rather outrageously. A son requests, or more accurately, demands from his father his inheritance. Now, it was customary. When a man dies, his estate, his inheritance, is split between his sons. Now, every son gets a portion, the exception being the eldest son gets a double portion. In other words, so if you got 8 sons, you split the estate 9 ways. 2 to the eldest, 1 to everybody else. If you got 2 sons, it's divided 3 ways. 2 to the older, 1 to the younger. Pretty simple. But to ask for that inheritance prior to your father's death is extremely disrespectful. Essentially, what he is wishing here is he's saying, I wish you were dead because I want what's coming to me when you die. Now, we're told nothing else about this younger son's his upbringing. We're not told how old he is. We're not told anything of his family relationships outside of the relationship with his elder brother a little bit and a little bit with his father. But what we do learn, what we do understand is the evidence from this story is this. This relationship soured, but not because the father didn't love the son. The father loved his son. The father was obviously not abusive. He did not mistreat his son. He desired good things for his son. He desired for his son to have everything that he had, no doubt. As we understand and we can see how calloused and how arrogant and full of pride you had to have been for this son to have walked up to his father and basically said, I wish you were dead. That is a true kind of hatred, and that is what sin is in a nutshell. Now, about this story, there is in no evidence we have that the father was required to meet this demand. Now, the situation's not pretty, and if people found out this is what was going on in this home and this is what the son did, it would be a black mark on that family. Everyone would know about this for years to come. And so even though he knew he didn't have to, even though he knew this was going to cause ripples within the community, even knowing this was not the best thing for his son to do and to have, knowing that this is actually, by doing this, his son is going to leave and go away, and this is going to cause a rift even more because of the distance in time and space, even knowing this is going to look bad for him and no one's going to applaud him for this decision, he still divides his estate and gives the younger son a third. Now, we don't know technically how this would have worked because in those days your value, you didn't have necessarily stockpiles of money, cash. You had houses and lands and goods and crops, etc., and all that kind of stuff, and livestock. So we don't know if possibly the father liquidated things or he divided it and gave the son the houses and the livestock and everything, and the son liquidated it. Maybe that's how it happened. We don't know. But either way, it's done. Now, the interesting fact about this is because of the hasty manner in which it is done, we understand that the prices of goods fluctuate up and down. So in order to divide his estate and to give his son money, or to give his son the things and for the son to liquidate them and have money that he could leave with, because he didn't travel with all these goods likely, the son likely received much less than he would have received had he waited for either his father to die and to receive the inheritance, or had he waited for the market to go up and so he sold the grains at a higher price than they would have at whatever time. So what he did in selling it all off to leave is he actually lost what could have been his, and that is a reminder to us about the immediacy nature of sin. It deceives you into taking less now because you got to get the greener pastures before they disappear. He journeyed a long way from home, and there we're told he, in a foreign land, wasted everything he had received from his father. No doubt, of course, he had a good time. A lot of fun, a lot of extravagance, and hence that is how the story got its title, The Prodigal Son, because the word prodigal is an adjective, and it means recklessly extravagant, or over-the-top extravagance, and it means having spent everything, or riotous living, as it's listed here. In other words, this is how the prodigal son lived his life. Extravagance, luxuries, whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted, however he wanted. No consideration of how expensive it was, no consideration of how quickly his money was dwindling, no recognition for how he was going to be able to maintain this lifestyle in the future. No, he was living for himself right then and now. And again, that is what sin does. Sin helps us and deceives us and gets us to get our eyes off of the future and get them on here and now and what can bring us pleasure in this moment. We can look at it like this. How could someone end up in, let's say, an extramarital affair? Because they weren't looking at the future and how things were going to be down the road, the devastation this would cause for centuries down the road. Instead, they were convinced by sin, they were tricked, if you will, by sin, that they needed to immediately engage in the greener pastures or else they weren't going to get them in the future, kind of thing. They were tricked into settling for less now than cultivating their own fields, which in the long run would produce much, much more in time. In the last couple weeks, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York reported that collectively Americans owe $1.14 trillion on credit cards. TransUnion reported that the average per-person credit card debt is $6,329. So, by comparison, that would mean my family should owe $50,000 in credit card debt. Thankfully, we don't. But I'm not against credit cards, but it is an amazing picture to look at it and to see the amount of money people will put on them just to keep up with the Joneses, if you will, just to keep up with everyone else in society, just to have the extravagant things that they don't have the money to have. They live by a higher means than they actually can afford. Financially, people live like the prodigal son. Generally speaking, obviously with such a high debt of credit cards that is not being paid off as it's supposed to be every month, it's obvious that these people didn't really consider the fact that there would be a day when their actual money, the actual money that they had and should have been living off of, is gone, and then the debtor, the credit card company, is going to come and say, hey, you owe me money. You need to pay the money now. They lived for here and now, but not for the future. Tabiti Onyebiwe stated it this way. He said, this is what living apart from Christ looks like from the vantage point of heaven. God the Father watches his rich but rebellious children squander his love and his riches as they run from him into the far country of sin. Sinners want all the goodness of God's creation and all the enjoyment of God's blessings, but they do not want God himself. Continues and says they do not understand his fatherhood. They refuse to return his love. Unless God restrains the sinner, they squander their lives and waste away as they chase every desire of the flesh. And so, chasing every desire of the flesh, the prodigal son did. He lived the high life, but then he faced the low life. Verses 14 through 16 says, and when he had spent all, there arose a mighty famine in that land, and he began to be in want. He went and joined himself to a citizen of that country, and he sent him into his fields to feed swine. And he would have fain have filled his belly with the husk that the swine did eat, and no man gave unto him. Again, regarding the dire financial state of many homes, in some, but not all cases, eventually there is a light bulb moment, if you will, where they stop and they look around and they realize the sheer amount of debt that they are in. Dave Ramsey says that they finally get sick and tired of being sick and tired. In other words, they hit a rock bottom moment that compels them to seek salvation from the financial hell, if you will, that they are living in. And so this younger son spent everything. Suddenly a mighty famine arises. Now, if it wasn't for the famine, maybe he could have figured out somehow to do it. Maybe he could have scraped by, but the might of this famine ensured his downfall. And it brought about something he had never, ever likely had before. See, he'd lived in his father's house until he left, and when he left his father's house, he lived in extravagance. But now he's feeling something, a new sensation, something he's unaccustomed to. True want, true need. He needs food, and there is no food, and he cannot buy any food. No government programs. Again, he's in a far country. He has no family, no friends. He's in serious trouble. And so we are told he goes and finds himself a job. Nothing illustrious, just a job feeding swine, pigs. This, however, brings him even lower. Swine were unclean animals. And no self-respecting Jew would have anything to do with swine in any capacity. See, here's a valuable truth, I suppose. It's amazing how when we're at the bottom of the barrel, we have to resort to and turn to and are forced to go to things we never ever thought we would end up doing. The shame that would be upon him and his family if anyone ever found out that he was at the bottom of the barrel with nothing else, feeding the uncleanest of animals. And there at the bottom of the barrel, we find his times of extravagance are exchanged for that which is basically inedible. He longed to eat the food that the pigs were eating, but we're told no one gave him anything. In other words, he would have gladly eaten what the pigs were eating, but nobody would have given him that. Nobody gave him that or anything else. He lived for himself, and now he lived all by himself. And again, such remains the nature of sin. To leave you unsatisfied, to leave you high and dry, and no shoulder with which to cry on. But here's good news. I know it doesn't sound like a great place to be in, but it is a good place to be in, because when you're at the bottom of the barrel, there's proverbially no way to go but up, or stay at the bottom of the barrel. Thus, we are going to see, number 3, that the prodigal son acknowledging the humble life. Verses 17 down through 21. And when he came to himself, he said, "How many hired servants of my father's have bread enough and to spare, and I perish with hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before thee, and am no more worthy to be called thy son. Make me as one of thy hired servants." And he arose and came to his father. When he was a great way off, his father saw him, and had compassion, and ran and fell on his neck and kissed him. And the son said unto him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in thy sight, and am no more worthy to be called thy son. But the father said to his servants. We'll pause there. In the worst place he had ever been, he looked up in his light bulb moment, his realization. Yeah, there's a mighty famine. But my father is so rich that even I know that without a third of his stuff that I took and left with, he's still got more. My father is so rich, I know that even in the midst of this mighty famine, my father was wise enough to have planned in advance, and he has more than enough to feed his servants, and more on top of that. So his mind begins to swirl, and he begins to think and consider all that's happened, and he thinks, because of all I've done, because of how I disrespected my father, because of the bridges that I burned leaving town, because of the way I've spent my inheritance, because of how broke I am, because of how all the unclean things that I've participated in and have been forced to do, the husk of the pigs I've had to eat, I know that there is no way I can go back to my father and expect my father to give me anything. But maybe there's a chance that he would be willing to hire me on as a servant. If I humbly admit to my sins, if I show that I realize I am unworthy, then maybe, just maybe, he'll have a little bit of pity on me and be willing to hire me as his servant. It's amazing the clarity that comes with the humility of the sinner. So we're told he makes his way home. A journey that was no doubt extremely difficult. The first time he left home and went to this far country, he had all the money in the world. He could do whatever he wanted to do and get there however he wanted to. Now he's got to go back in the midst of a famine and he's got absolutely nothing. What we see amazingly is the father's response. Run to him, hold him, kiss him, and he starts into his speech. And he gets halfway through before the father cuts him off. And he never gets to finish it. We'll consider, again, the phenomenal and the shocking response of the father next week. But today I'd like us to consider simply this first section about the son. The first thing I'd like us to understand is this. We all live or lived the high life. Now I understand we've all done it in a different manner, in a different way, but the truth is we are all living in currently the high life. We're living like the prodigal right now, or we have lived that way. We used to live that way. So first we understand this. There are two types of being a child of God. There is one type of being a child of God in that we are a creation of His. We are made in His image. We are created by His Son. We are molded, as Psalm 39 says, 139 I believe it is, says that we are literally made by the fingers of God. Jesus made us. So in that sense, we are children of God. But we are not children of God in the salvation sense, if you will. No, we haven't been adopted into that sense yet. But all of us are children of God in the first sense, and as such, there is a time of innocence in which we are protected by the Father during that time of innocence. We often put it this way. Children who die, they don't go to hell, they go to heaven. They go to be the Father because of their innocence. They have not readily and specifically chosen to rebel against God yet. However, during that time of innocence, sin begins to present itself. It becomes thrilling. And sin produces, and the devil shows us the high life of sin and how good it would be. And unfortunately, with a 100% success rate, we are all convinced, like our father Adam, to sin. And so each one of us becomes a prodigal. Some for a shorter time, some for a longer time. But as prodigals, we live we live recklessly extravagant. In other words, not necessarily with our money, but with our souls. We play with fire with our souls, if you will. And we live with little to no thought of the future and the fact of this. The day is going to come and the creditor is going to demand payment for the debt of sin we have racked up and up and up and up. But the problem is we're quickly going to find out we're broke. We don't have anything to pay off this debt. Whatever inheritance we had in the beginning is gone. We're unable to pay the price that's required. Now, understand this. There are some prodigals that are not as bad, if you will. And they do a lot of good deeds, and they do a lot of good things, and they give to the church, and they give to charity, and they show support for all these different groups, and they do all these different things, and they think and they hope that when the call for payment for the debt of my sins is made, when the debtor wants to be paid, they think, I hope I've done enough. I hope I've stockpiled enough good deeds that the debtor will look at my debt of sin and the good deeds and be like, okay, you just eked out. You just got enough to pay off the debt. As hopeful as that might seem, as we understand from the Bible, we will all fall short of that threshold. And thus, all prodigals, all people, find themselves that they will face, so all of us either will face or we have faced the low life. Sin sucks all the joy from our lives. Don't worry, I'm not deluded. Sin is very pleasurable for a season. The devil knows this, and in his attempts to keep us living the high life, he introduces more and more and more and more risk into sin. But eventually the bottom of the barrel comes for everyone in various places. The reality is the only way out of the prodigal life is to get sick and tired of treading the water in the muck and the mire of sin. But there's good news. I know it doesn't seem like it. Again, it doesn't seem like there's good news, but the good news of being at the bottom of the barrel, sick and tired of the muck and the mire of sin, is that there at the bottom of the barrel, you are given two choices. You can either stay there, or you can look up. And when you look up, you have this opportunity in that all of us must acknowledge, or we have already acknowledged, the humbled life. Again, the clarity that comes to the sinner who's sitting at the bottom of the barrel, and the realization that our Father is at home just waiting for his children to come around the bend. Every prodigal must be willing to admit that they are sinners and they are unworthy to be called the Father's son anymore. But then every prodigal must be willing to do the hardest part, and the hardest part is going home. And the tale of the tape has revealed this. There are a lot of people in the world that are willing to admit that they are sinners, willing to admit that they are not worthy of God's grace, but when it comes down to it, the pride in their life refuses to allow them to actually go to the Father and have his grace. The truth is, for every prodigal that refuses to go home, every day it gets harder and harder and harder and harder to do so. But for every prodigal that will humble themselves and approach the Father and confess and say, I know I'm a sinner. I know I'm not worthy to be called your son. And as they begin to try and say, if you'll just make me one of your hired servants, no sooner than they try to say that, they will be cut off and not be able to finish their speech like this son did. Because when you are willing to humble yourself and go home to the Father, the compassion, the overwhelming compassion of the Father, his compassion that is full of grace, full of mercy, full of love, it will make its way through the fiber of every being like that. The way Tim Keller put it in his heavily influential book, The Prodigal God, is this: God's love and forgiveness can pardon and restore any and every kind of sin or wrongdoing. It doesn't matter who you are or what you've done. It doesn't matter if you've deliberately oppressed or even murdered people or how much you've abused yourself. The younger brother knew that in his father's house there was abundant food to spare. But he also discovered that there was grace to spare. There is no evil that the Father's love cannot pardon and cover. There is no sin that is a match for his grace. Maybe in the words of William Kirkpatrick, the encouragement would be this: I've wandered far away from God, now I'm coming home. The paths of sin too long I've trod, Lord, I'm coming home. I've wasted many precious years. I now repent with bitter tears. I've tired of sin and straying, Lord. I'll trust thy love, believe thy word. My soul is sick, my heart is sore. My strength renew, my hope restore. And then the chorus, coming home, never more to roam. Open wide thine arms of love, Lord, I'm coming home. What a beauty to know. We could be, and all of us have been, or either are currently, like the prodigal son. But there is no evil. There is no sin. There is no living like a prodigal. There's no having spent everything. There's no riotous living that any of us could ever do so much of that the Father's love cannot pardon, and we will not find grace more than enough and overflowing every single day for us. It's a beautiful truth. And so the question must remain, are you still wandering like the prodigal, or have you come home? Hopefully the beauty of the living Word of God and just this first part of the whole picture here, or I should say the second part of the whole picture of Luke 15, the mini snapshot of all that the Father has done for us. Hopefully it will help fill your soul. Hopefully, as they sang in the song there from the cathedrals, I guess I'll just go home and meet with the Father. Hopefully that's helpful for your soul this week.